Welcome to the statistic podcastles of Academia Libera Mentis, the free thinking place in the Ardennes, Belgium. This is going to be a podcast about statistics. We're going to go in depth into one piece of statistics and really explain to you what is going on. Because very normally in many universities and academies, they quickly show you something and you're supposed to believe. But if you really go into the data, you can get a lot out of it and you will see nearly always a few skeletons in the cupboard. Today's topic will be happiness, life satisfaction, well-being, the things that make life worthwhile around the world. I'm going to give you one graph and we're going to be looking at 5 questions. The first question will be whether people in different countries are equally happy about their life. And you can already answer yourself. Would I expect that to be the case or not? Who knows, right? Data is useful for that. A secondary question would be, well, where should you emigrate if you wanted to have a happy life, a good life? What are the places to be? What are the places not to be? Third one, is it true that poor countries are happier? They're poor, but they're happy. They've got each other. Is that true? Is that not true? Who knows? Data will tell. A fourth question, the other side of that. Are there rich countries with unhappy people? Right? Are there very rich places in the world where people are miserable despite their material wealth? And the fifth question, around the world, is there such a thing as a happy culture? Is there such a thing as an unhappy culture? And what makes those cultures unhappy? We're going to be talking about all of that on the basis of data. The following data was gathered in 2017, reported in the World Happiness Report of 2018, and based on Gallup poll data. Here is the question, as it were, in its full form that was answered by people all around the world. In most countries, you're talking about 500 or 1,000. In the US and India and some other places, you're talking about several thousand people making up this map of the world. And red is extremely unhappy, and 10 is extremely happy. And we'll be talking more in depth about how this is measured and what this actually means. So what is the essence of the question that over the last 30, 40 years, in fact, millions of people have been asked around the world? Well, this particular graph is based on what is known as the Cantril question. And it roughly goes by asking people to think of a ladder of life, where the best possible life would be a 10 and the worst possible life would be a 0. And then people are asked, between the scale of 0 and 10, where do you stand now? And you see that the average answer in Northern Europe and in Canada is between a 7 and an 8. Places like Finland, the Netherlands have often just been above an 8, just below an 8. Same goes for Australia. And the unhappiest places in the world in 2017 were places like Afghanistan, between a 1 and a 2, a 2 and a 3, very, very, very low. A huge difference on this 0 to 10 scale. Or South Sudan. And what was going on in 2017 in South Sudan and in Afghanistan? Well, both were in a state of civil war, in a state of enormous conflicts. And so already you can see that it sort of makes sense what the most unhappy places in the world were in 2017. Right. Let us then go to our 5 questions. Right. Are people in different countries equally happy about their life? Does it matter? Well, we've already seen that the answer is that there are big differences, but let's talk a little bit about what the state of as it were, the good life is around the world. I said before, the happiest places, Canada, Northern Europe, Australia, New Zealand, the Emiratis, Costa Rica over in Latin America. But if you look at the large swathe of things, you see that Asia is not a particularly happy place. India is between a 3 and a 4 and a 5 in this graph. China between a 5 and a 6. Japan, South Korea between a 5 and a 6. Indonesia, the same. Africa is well below a 5 on average in most regions. Certainly Sub-Sahara but also Egypt is a fairly unhappy place. The Gulf countries, some of them are reasonably happy, such as Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Israel. Latin America is surprisingly happy, between about a 6 and a 7 on average. Brazil, Argentina, the countries with a lot of population, are actually reasonably happy. Venezuela, not so happy. And what went on? It's between a 3 and a 4. What went on in that period? They too had a lot of civil strife. The US, a very rich country, but not the happiest in the world. Only between a 6 and a 7 on average. And if you look at that, you sort of think, well, okay, at least the average answer in these countries, it makes sense, but it's very different. Right? There's a huge difference between 0 and 10, between something that's a 2 and something that's close to an 8. So we can answer the first question very clearly, that yes, there is a big difference in the average happiness answer of people around the globe. And of course, these are average answers in a country. So you will find in every country that there are extremely miserable people and there are extremely happy people. But nevertheless, the average difference is quite astonishing. And if you look at that little country there, that is between a 4 and a 5, that is actually Ukraine, right? Which was already then in a state of civil war, particularly on the eastern side, and indeed within Ukraine, it was the eastern provinces which then were much less happy than the other provinces of that country, which of course will be doubly true today. And so looking at the graph, you can already say, well, sort of seems to make sense. Let's then move to the second one. Right? Where should you emigrate if you want a good life? Well, obviously, you should potentially want to go to the happier places. But that depends on two things on which happiness and well-being researchers like myself know a lot about. The first question is, well, if you go to a country, you integrate, you join in with how life is done there, do you actually become as happy as the average in that country? Right? And the surprising answer is sort of yes, and also relatively quickly. Right? Unless you form a huge subculture and you basically don't change how you behave at all, you do get to join in the social life of the country that you're in. You adopt the language, you get a job there, you find partners, and you will very quickly adopt the lifestyle of that country, and that comes with a similar level of happiness as the natives there have. So if you join in, if you integrate, then you do pretty quickly. In the case of Australia, for instance, we know that migrants within months sort of adapt to the Australian level of happiness. And also North America, Northern Europe, there is actually a lot of integration happening fairly quickly over time. So then you can ask yourself, well, okay, that might be true for the people who go there. Yeah, but well, do people migrate to these happier places or do they migrate elsewhere? Well, ask yourself, how many people migrate to China, migrate to India, migrate to Africa? Very, very few. People migrate out of those areas because they're unhappy areas. So the average migration pattern is from unhappy to happy. It is not from happy to unhappy. So when people vote with their feet, when they move, they do indeed, roughly speaking, go to the happier places. And that is actually most interestingly visible when you look at places which are also rich, where you could also move to for a job, for instance, which would be an alternative way of looking at migration patterns. Japan is notoriously rich, it's got a well-functioning economy, lots of jobs, but do you think people go there to live permanently? Not really, and you can see here why. Right? Their happiness level is between a 5 and a 6, very, very low for a country that is as rich as that. Also within Europe, if you look at the happier places, that is indeed where the migration streams are happier. Britain is a happier place there than, in that case, was France or Italy, and indeed, where did many migrants want to be? They wanted to be in Britain in that case. And also, Germany, the Netherlands, Scandinavia have seen large migration streams over time. And if you look at, for instance, Eastern Europe, well, much less happy, and also people don't migrate there. Right? They move from Eastern Europe to Western Europe in this particular period. And that has some cultural reasons, some economic reasons that we will talk about. Let's then pick the third one. Are poor countries happier? Right? It's a romantic ideal that it really doesn't matter how rich a country is. You can be poor and nevertheless be very happy, right? Because you have warm social relations in those countries. Is that true? Well, you find the opposite is actually true. If you look at the poorer places in this world, which is of course much of Africa, but also much of Southeast Asia, including India, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, Burma, Afghanistan, Pakistan, in that period also still China, Mongolia. These places weren't very rich, and well, they also weren't very happy. Indeed, you won't find a country which is below a 6, which is not sort of pretty unhappy, right? Pretty unhappy. So by and large, poor means on average relatively unhappy. And if you ask them, so, well, is there something that compensates for that? Do people perhaps live longer in poorer countries? No, unfortunately not. It's not in this graph, but by and large, rich means that people live longer. So the average life expectancy in a place like Japan, Europe, 80, 82. Average life expectancy in India at that moment, around about 65. In Africa, well below that. And so no, it is not the case that there is something obviously compensating. And then if you ask yourself, well, why is there such high levels of unhappiness in these African countries? Right? Well, if you look at the mental drivers of this, it's a lot of anxiety in those places. A lot of anxiety as to whether they or their children are going to be victims of crime, are going to have a life that is sort of, reasonably comfortable, whether they will have opportunities, whether they can get decent jobs, whether they can actually compete with the rest of the world. And you find a lot of anxiety also in India, which is of course a huge population, in China, and in the poor countries of this world. So if you ask yourself, why is poverty associated with these low levels of happiness, these low levels of thinking well about yourself, thinking that you are low on the ladder of life? It's anxiety. A lot of anxiety about the future, a lot of uncertainty as to where the next meal is going to come from and whether one can survive all the dangers of criminality and other dangers in those countries. So there's actually a reasonably good reason why poor and unhappiness go together, which is of course the same reason why people would migrate from poor to rich countries. Then the other side of the questions, right? Are there rich countries with unhappy people? Does rich automatically mean the same as happiness? And there we've already shown you the answer by talking about a couple of countries, right? So for instance, take the US versus Canada. Right? US, a bit richer. Canadians are happier. It's a happier culture. It's a warmer culture. It's less violent, less aggression, right? Which is not a very endearing aspect of a country. Also, if you look within Europe, you will find that the Eastern European places are markedly less happy than the Western European places. Greece, right, that whole Balkan area, which was okay, was not as rich, but also markedly less happy than the rest of Europe, but particularly Japan. Right? Japan stands out as a very rich country, but relatively unhappy. Right? Also the same as for South Korea. Japan is quite a bit richer than many European countries, but nevertheless unhappier. Why is that? Right? What is it that makes the Japanese a fairly miserable people? Even though they live quite long, they've got good diets, it's fairly equal, it is a cohesive, well-functioning society. Well, happiness researchers have looked at that for a long, long time. And the best answer they can come to is that we're looking at a very rigid culture in which you have to behave in extremely scripted manners towards everybody else, right? You sort of can't express yourself much. You have to always sort of, be aware of what other people might think of you, and also be aware of other people's inconvenience and other people's unhappiness. And you think, well, that's great, isn't it? Isn't that the happiest you could have as a country when everybody's busy with whether everybody else is happy? And the answer to that is no. No, because if you're all busy with how happy everybody else is, nobody's busy being happy. Nobody is busy having a good time. Right? So it's like everybody is the bartender and nobody is the party goer. you need the party goers as well to actually enjoy the party, not just the people who are sort of quietly serving the party. And that, roughly speaking, is the problem in a place like Japan, but it's also the problem in a place like South Korea, and it's a problem with these collectivist cultures in general there. So you also have that in China, which is also a relatively miserable place because it's not as exuberant and not the same level of sort of personal freedoms. And this is where the West definitely excels, right? People can come, be extroverted, join the party if you like, right? And enjoy both the economic freedoms, but also the personal freedoms to sort of express themselves. And that seems to be a very important component of these happiness levels. And the final question, are there happy and unhappy cultures? We just talked about the collectivist Asian cultures being relatively unhappy, but they're not the only ones. And we've got stories as to what is going on. Let me particularly point out Latin America, right? Latin America, right, is a large region, also includes, of course, Mexico and the whole isthmus part. They're relatively happy there. Yes, the poor people who are there would like to move upwards and join happy communities within the US and other places, but they're actually a pretty happy culture themselves, except, of course, for the regions where you have local strife, like Venezuela at that time, Peru, and some of those other coastal places. Now, what makes the Latino culture reasonably happy? We actually have a reasonable idea why that is. They've got very warm family lives. They've got very warm friendships. People really look out for each other. If they make friends with each other, they don't, as it were, give each other what you're supposed to give. They really help each other. They help each other with jobs, girls, boys. They help each other with parties. They hug each other. There's a lot of touching, right? It's very important for feeling social connections as you touch each other. They don't do that in Japan, but they do that in Latin America. So there's a lot of dancing, a lot of movements, a lot of sensuality, but particularly, and this is the key ingredient in happiness throughout the world, and it's a very human need, is to have social, warm relationships, to have real friendships, to have strong family bonds. And that is something that Latin America really excels at, even though being only a middle-income area, they're not particularly rich, but they're much richer in terms of culture than, let us say, Japan, obviously, but also Eastern Europe, which is on average quite a bit richer than Latin America, which in this period did not really have these strong family and friendship ties to the same degree, right? A much more miserable culture. So if you then ask yourself, well, okay, the Eastern Europeans and the sort of the Southeastern Europeans, why were they so miserable on average? Well, this is partly a Slavic unhappiness puzzle, if you like, right? It's been these are Orthodox church places, very dour. You're supposed to serve. You're supposed to look up to authority to a huge degree. If you go to the churches there, you stand up, you get preached to. It is not the happiest form of sort of interaction between the powerful and the powerless. So you find a lot of bullying there. You find they come from a history and a culture whereby there was a lot of feudalism, and feudalism is hence where large layers of the population were deemed very unimportant. We just sort of had to do what was said, and a layer of bullies enforcing that. And so that has changed a lot. After 1990, those regions have become happier and happier over time. And so you see that particularly in places like Romania and Poland. They've sort of gone away from that fairly unhappy culture, but that is a reasonably unhappy region, right? And has been for a long, long time. Right? So that's another example of particular happy or unhappy culture. If you then look at the happiest places, Northern Europe, Scandinavia, the Netherlands has been in there, the Germanic places like Switzerland and Austria, they sort of have, particularly in that period, most of the best things in life. Well-functioning economies, reasonably well-working family lives and friendship lives, very low levels of violence, right? There's very, very safe places. The cities are very clean and pretty, plenty of jobs going, so almost no one is unemployed who wants to have a job. It's almost a high point, as it were, of human existence, right? The same is true for Canada in that period as well. Right? Fairly happy, warm cultures. If you then ask yourself, okay, what is going on in the good old USA? Well, the USA, from which the Gallup company comes, that organize all this data, they are less happy than many of the others, and that's partially because inequality there is very high. So at the top, life is great, but at the bottom, life is not so great there. Right? And then you have great difficulties with crime, you have great difficulties with unemployment, with at least not being in, as it were, a recognized high-status job. You really feel down. There's a huge prison population there. And so life is tough at the bottom in the US, and there are a lot of people in the bottom at the US. So that too can be seen within the rich countries as not a super happy place. Right? We already talked about the collectivist countries. They also have a reasonable unhappy culture, if you like. But there's another region where they're not doing so badly, in the Gulf places. Right? So Saudi Arabia, Emiratis, Qatar, they too have a warm family culture. Very strong families where people really look after each other and they form a unit with each other. They also do a lot of touching with each other. It's at least behind closed doors. And so they, as it were, feel protected. And I've actually lectured for many years in Saudi Arabia. And their culture, when it comes to family and friendship, is very similar to Latin America. And so, if you like, the rest of the world can learn something of those family and friendships cultures. If you then look at the biggest surprise is a country which isn't that rich, but which is just as happy as the happiest rich places. And it's there, that tiny little thing is just as green, so between a 7 and an 8, as Northern Europe, Australia, and Canada. What is it? Costa Rica. It also has the best of many worlds. It's not super rich, it's only middle income, government isn't particularly well functioning, but people have great social lives, low crime levels, a high degree of security. The economy is not doing so badly, and it is not infested by drug gangs. That helps, of course, as well. But it's very stable, and it's a place where people have a good time in life. And so, can the rest of the world learn something from cultures? Judging from this map, we should all be looking out for what was happening in Costa Rica. And same is actually true for a place like Mexico. Yes, Mexico had great troubles with drug gangs in that time, but also in Mexico, they have these warm friendships, warm family life, which compensates an awful lot. And so sure, some people want to be richer and move up, but if they move up, they actually move to other Mexican or Spanish-speaking communities elsewhere. If we then ask ourselves, okay, this is your story, this is the story of the mainstream literature here, what as it were are the counter-arguments that one can make to these claims? Well, these counter-arguments are not convincing to me, because otherwise I wouldn't have told you the previous things, but it's important to always hear the counter-arguments, right? The first counter-argument you can say is, well, these questions, they're very subjective. Ladder of life, good life, worst possible life. How do people possibly answer that? Right? Can I trust anything of that? Right? Well, again, there is a huge literature looking into that. And if you say, well, it's all nonsense, you have to contend with a couple of things. One is that people who say they're higher on this ladder of life, they're healthier, their social relations are better within the countries that they are. Right? So within the US, the people who give a higher number for this ladder of life are exactly also the people with better health, better social relationships, more stable jobs. They've basically got more going for them than the others on average. And particularly the social relations is an important aspect of that story. If you then look at within the rich countries who has a low ladder of life, these are indeed the people. They're miserable, depressed, anxious, unemployed, without friends, with poor physical health as well. And so it lines up. It's not that people just give an answer willy-nilly within these countries. If you then ask yourself, well, does it make sense to compare them by countries? Right? Do people roughly answer them in the same way in different places? Well, we've already encountered 3 pieces of knowledge which tell you that probably they are interpreting this question in a similar way. One is, if you look at the very unhappy places, well, those are sort of civil war places. So there's Afghanistan in Asia, Southern Sudan in Africa, and Venezuela in Latin America. Yes, these are going through civil strife. And surprise, surprise, that's where the low answers are, which is exactly where you'd expect them to be. And furthermore, if you ask yourself, well, where's the migration stream to? Do people go to the unhappy places because supposedly they answer these questions very differently? No, of course not. People from India, for instance, they move to Europe, particularly, of course, the UK. They move to Australia. They move to the US. So people go from relatively unhappy in the same question to much happier and, of course, richer at the same time. But, for instance, they don't go, right? They do not go to Japan. Is there any of that? Hell no, right? That does not occur. So the relatively unhappy Indians, they move to where the happiness and the money is at the same time. And that speaks towards a notion of a kind of a universal interpretation of what it means to have a good life. And that's also another piece of information that we've discovered, is that if you sort of look at happy people, you can see it. You can see it in their faces. They smile, they're warm, more confident. They express it in, these, 40, 50 facial muscles that we all have, which we can all see. And we talk about people in that way. Oh, they seem happy. They smile a lot. They seem well adjusted. And we can even see it in videos of other people. So if you see videos of sort of, tribes in the Amazon, you can actually pick out the happy tribe members and the unhappy tribe members. And the same goes the opposite way around. So one of the most fascinating studies in this area was where they took videos of people in New York and they showed them to the sort of undiscovered tribes in the Amazon and said, well, which one of these is happier? And they picked out the obvious ones. They picked out the New Yorkers who smiled a lot with more confidence. And you can even see it in how people walk. On average, the happy people walk faster and they walk with a more smooth gait. And so the argument that people just, are not serious when they answer this question and it means nothing, well, that doesn't really seem to be the case. A second worry you may have about this kind of data is that, well, the person who gathered it can always manipulate it. Right? You can always manipulate subjective questions like, how are you going on this ladder of life? It's very easy to manipulate it. We know the tricks. If we really want you to give a high answer, we make you feel good. We ask you, what's the most wonderful moment you've had in your life? And if we ask then, how are you going on this ladder, you'll give us a much higher answer than if we ask you, what is the worst moment in your life? So we can talk you up or we can talk you down in the surveys that ask these things. Well, the strongest indication that dynamic is not going on too much here is, of course, that the US, from where this data doesn't come out shining as the top country. So if they wanted to manipulate it, surely they would have come up with a different answer. And the second one is, again, that the answer sort of makes sense across these places. And furthermore, they line up with other data. So I'm just showing you here effectively the Gallup data, but you have lots of other data. You have the Eurostat data, you have the Latino barometer, you've got the ISSP data. We have lots of data sets and they roughly show a similar picture. So I've not, as it were, cherry picked, I've given you what I regard as a sort of a mainstream data picture answer. And so those are the strongest, as it were, counters that one sort of has come up with this kind of data. And I'm not personally convinced, but I think it's very important for students to always be a little bit skeptical about any data and continue to cross-check it with other things that they know about the world. So I hope that was informative, and I trust you will watch us again for more statistics podcastles from Haute Beaumont in the Ardennes.